9 military bases, that is what stands between the United States and the loss of Taiwan. Not aircraft carriers, not missile defense systems, not diplomatic agreements or security guarantees. 9 bases on Philippine soil that allow American fighters to reach the Taiwan Strait in under 2 hours, that position reconnaissance aircraft within range of Chinese naval movements, that enable the rapid deployment of ground forces if Beijing moves on Taipei. And in the first week of March 2026, the President of the Philippines sat down with Chinese officials and signed 3 economic agreements worth billions of dollars, while his defense minister publicly questioned whether those 9 American bases serve Philippine interests or American ones. This is not a hypothetical future crisis. This is happening now. And if the Philippines closes those bases or even restricts American access to them in ways that degrade operational capability, the entire architecture of American power projection in the Indo-Pacific collapses. Not over years, over weeks. Because without the Philippines, the United States cannot defend Taiwan. Without Taiwan, American semiconductor supply chains fail. Without those supply chains, the American tech sector contracts. And without the tech sector, American economic dominance erodes. The chain reaction starts with 9 bases in a country that is currently deciding whether its future lies with Washington or Beijing, and Beijing is winning that debate. Start with what happened in the last 72 hours. Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. met with Chinese Vice Premier Ding Xuexiang in Manila and signed agreements covering infrastructure development, agricultural trade, and technology cooperation. The stated value of the agreements was not disclosed in initial reports, but Philippine economic analysts cited by regional media estimated the package at somewhere between $3 and $5 billion over the next 3 years. That number matters because it is approximately double what the United States provides the Philippines annually in combined military aid, development assistance, and trade preferences. The timing matters too. The agreements were signed less than 2 weeks after Marcos publicly criticized what he called American reluctance to clearly state whether the US would defend the Philippines if Chinese forces attacked Philippine vessels or personnel in disputed waters of the South China Sea. Marcos did not call it abandonment, he called it ambiguity. But in the language of alliance politics, ambiguity is abandonment with better public relations. And China heard the message. Within 72 hours of Marcos voicing that criticism, Chinese officials were in Manila with a package of economic commitments designed to demonstrate that Beijing, unlike Washington, delivers tangible benefits without requiring the Philippines to host foreign military forces or participate in encirclement strategies against its largest trading partner. And that largest trading partner status is not rhetorical. China is the Philippines' top trading partner by a wide margin. Bilateral trade between the Philippines and China reached $88 billion in 2025, according to Philippine customs data. Trade between the Philippines and the United States reached $27 billion in the same period. That is a 3-to-1 ratio. For every dollar of commerce the Philippines conducts with the United States, it conducts 3 with China. And that ratio has been growing, not shrinking, every year since 2020. This creates a structural problem for American strategy that no amount of military aid or diplomatic pressure can solve. The Philippines depends on China economically in ways it does not depend on the United States. Rice imports, construction materials, consumer electronics, pharmaceutical ingredients, infrastructure financing. These are not luxuries, these are necessities, and China provides them at scale and at prices that American exporters cannot or will not match. So when the United States asks the Philippines to host 9 military bases explicitly designed to counter Chinese military expansion and to participate in exercises and operations that Beijing views as hostile encirclement, the Philippine government must weigh the value of American security commitments against the cost of Chinese economic retaliation. And increasingly, that cost looks higher than the value. The 9 bases in question are not symbolic. They are the operational backbone of American military presence in the Western Pacific. Under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement signed in 2014 and expanded in 2023, the United States has access to 9 designated locations across the Philippine archipelago. These locations include former US bases like Clark Air Base and Subic Bay, which the Philippines evicted American forces from in the 1990s and has now allowed them to return to under-rotating deployment arrangements. They also include newer sites positioned strategically near the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. The value of these bases to American war planning is difficult to overstate. Clark Air Base, located approximately 80 kilometres northwest of Manila, provides the United States with a major logistics and airlift hub capable of handling C-17 Globemaster transports and aerial refuelling operations. Without Clark, American fighter aircraft operating from Guam or Okinawa cannot sustain extended combat air patrols over the Taiwan Strait or South China Sea. The distance is too great. The refuelling requirements are too demanding. Clark is the node that makes sustained air operations possible. Subic Bay on Luzon's western coast gives the US Navy access to deepwater port facilities capable of servicing destroyers, amphibious assault ships, and logistics vessels without needing to return to Guam or Japan. In a Taiwan contingency, Subic becomes a forward resupply point that cuts transit times for surface combatants by days. Days matter when ammunition stocks deplete and fuel runs low. The bases in northern Luzon, particularly those near Cagayan province, are even more critical. These locations position American reconnaissance assets, missile defense batteries, and rapid deployment forces within 200 kilometers of Taiwan. That proximity is irreplaceable. No other US treaty ally offers basing that close to Taiwan. Japan's southern islands are farther. Guam is over 2,000 kilometers away. If the United States loses access to northern Luzon bases, it loses the ability to provide credible real-time intelligence and missile defense support to Taiwan in the opening hours of a Chinese attack. And the opening hours are when wars are decided. China knows this, which is why Chinese diplomats, economists, and military planners have spent the last 5 years carefully, methodically building a counter-strategy designed not to invade the Philippines or coerce it militarily, but to make the cost of hosting American forces higher than the benefit. The strategy has three components: economic inducement, diplomatic isolation, and strategic patience. Economic inducement means flooding the Philippines with investment, trade deals, infrastructure projects, and financial assistance that create dependencies Beijing can leverage. The Belt and Road Initiative in the Philippines includes port development, railway construction, power plant financing, and telecommunications infrastructure. Huawei built significant portions of the Philippines' 4G network and is positioned to do the same for 5G if the government permits it. Chinese state-owned enterprises have financed and constructed bridges, highways, and flood control systems across Luzon and Mindanao. These projects employ Filipino workers, use Filipino subcontractors, and generate political goodwill for local officials who can claim credit for infrastructure improvements their constituents see and use daily. The economic inducement is not charity, it is leverage. Once the Philippines depends on Chinese financing for infrastructure, Chinese imports for goods, and Chinese markets for exports, Beijing gains the ability to impose costs for decisions it dislikes. If Manila allows American forces to operate more aggressively from Philippine bases, Chinese customs inspections of Philippine agricultural products slow down. Financing for the next railway project gets delayed. Tariffs on Philippine electronics exports increase. These are not announced as retaliatory measures. They are framed as routine regulatory adjustments or economic policy shifts. But the timing is never coincidental, and Philippine officials understand the message. Diplomatic isolation means ensuring that every time the Philippines aligns with American positions on South China Sea disputes, it finds itself standing nearly alone among Southeast Asian nations. China has cultivated close relationships with Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar. These countries reliably block or dilute NRCN statements critical of Chinese behaviour in disputed waters. When the Philippines brought its South China Sea territorial claims to international arbitration in 2016 and won a ruling that rejected China's expansive claims, not a single ASEAN country publicly endorsed the ruling in terms that would anger Beijing. The Philippines won legally, it lost diplomatically, and it learned that international law without enforcement is just expensive paper. Strategic patience means waiting, not pressuring, not threatening, just waiting for the internal political dynamics of Philippine democracy to produce leaders who calculate that the economic benefits of Chinese partnership outweigh the security benefits of American alliance. And those leaders are emerging. Marcos himself is not anti-American, but he is transactional. He wants concrete benefits. He wants clear commitments. And when he asks whether the United States will defend Philippine vessels if China attacks them, and the answer he gets is carefully worded statements about treaty obligations being interpreted in light of circumstances, he hears ambiguity. And ambiguity does not pay for roads or import rice or finance power plants. So Marcos hedges, he maintains the American alliance, but he takes Chinese money. He participates in US military exercises, but he signs economic agreements with Beijing. He criticizes Chinese aggression in the South China Sea, but he avoids actions that would trigger Chinese economic retaliation. This is not weakness. This is the rational behavior of a leader managing an alliance with a distant superpower and an economic relationship with a neighboring giant. And the more he hedges, the more Beijing's patient strategy succeeds, because hedging is not alliance reliability, and alliance reliability is what American war plans for Taiwan require. The Pentagon's operational concept for defending Taiwan assumes that in the opening phase of a Chinese attack, American forces can surge into the region using bases in Japan, South Korea, Guam, and the Philippines. The concept assumes those bases will be available without restriction, that host nations will grant overflight permissions immediately, that logistics flows will not be interrupted by political negotiations or diplomatic delays. It assumes alliance solidarity. But alliance solidarity is exactly what China's strategy is designed to erode, and it is working. Japan has already signaled that its participation in a Taiwan defense scenario would depend on whether the conflict is framed as a defensive response to Chinese aggression or an American offensive operation. South Korea has made even more cautious statements, emphasizing that its alliance with the United States does not automatically extend to conflicts beyond the Korean Peninsula. These are allies with formal mutual defense treaties, deep military integration, and decades of joint planning, and even they are hedging. The Philippines, which has a far less robust alliance framework and far greater economic exposure to China, is hedging even more, and that hedging has material operational consequences. If American commanders cannot assume unrestricted base access, they must plan for delays. If they must plan for delays, they must preposition more forces forward in peacetime, which increases costs and political visibility. If they cannot preposition, they must accept longer response times in a crisis, and longer response times in a Taiwan scenario mean that by the time American forces arrive in strength, Chinese forces have already achieved their initial objectives. This is the strategic problem the United States faces in the Indo-Pacific. It is not that American military capabilities are inadequate. It is that American military capabilities depend on a network of overseas bases hosted by countries that have strong economic incentives to deny or restrict access if doing so avoids Chinese retaliation. The Pentagon calls this the anti-access and area denial problem. But the real problem is not Chinese missiles or submarines. It is Philippine, Japanese, and Korean cost-benefit calculations. And those calculations are tilting away from Washington. The 3 economic agreements Marcos signed with China in the last 72 hours are part of that tilt. They are not dramatic. They do not close American bases. They do not terminate the alliance. But they deepen Philippine economic integration with China in ways that make future confrontation more costly for Manila. And every increment of increased cost is an increment of decreased reliability for American war planners. The Pentagon knows this, which is why in the last 6 months, American officials have made multiple high-level visits to Manila to reassure Marcos, to increase military aid, to accelerate infrastructure projects under the Luzon Economic Corridor Initiative announced in 2023. The United States is trying to compete with China economically in the Philippines, but it is competing with one hand tied behind its back because American development finance moves slowly, requires congressional approval, and comes with conditions about governance, transparency, and human rights that Chinese financing does not. China offers money with no political strings. The United States offers less money with more strings. From a Philippine perspective, the choice is not about values or ideology. It is about which partner delivers tangible benefits faster and with fewer complications. And on that metric, China wins. The implications extend beyond the Philippines. Every Asian country watching this dynamic sees the same pattern. Economic integration with China brings benefits. Security alignment with the United States brings risks. If war comes, American military power might protect you, but war is uncertain and economically catastrophic. What is certain is that if you anger Beijing, your economy suffers immediately. Tariffs increase, inspections slow, financing stops, tourists stop coming, and no amount of American military hardware compensates for that. So countries hedge, they maintain American alliances for security insurance, but they deepen Chinese economic ties for prosperity, and they calibrate their hedging to maximize benefits from both while minimizing costs from either. This is not betrayal, this is rationality, but it creates a situation where the United States cannot count on alliance solidarity when it needs it most. Taiwan is where this all converges. American strategy for defending Taiwan requires bases in the Philippines, Japan, and potentially South Korea. It requires those bases to be available immediately without political delays or access restrictions. It requires host nations to accept that allowing American forces to operate from their territory will make them targets for Chinese retaliation. And it requires them to accept those risks despite having enormous economic stakes in avoiding confrontation with Beijing. That is an enormous ask, and as China's economic leverage grows, it becomes a harder ask to fulfill. The Philippines is the test case. If Marcos decides that the economic costs of hosting American bases outweigh the security benefits, and if he either closes the bases or imposes restrictions that degrade their operational value, the entire American posture in the Western Pacific must be reconceived. Guam becomes the primary hub, but Guam is 2,000 kilometers from Taiwan. That distance reduces sortie rates, increases fuel requirements, and lengthens response times in ways that give China significant operational advantages. Japan could partially compensate, but Japan has its own political constraints and its own vulnerability to Chinese economic pressure. And Japan knows that if war comes, it will be on the front line. Japanese bases will be struck. Japanese cities could be targeted. The Japanese public's willingness to support that level of risk for Taiwan's sake is uncertain at best. So the Philippines matters, not because it is the most powerful American ally, but because it is the most vulnerable to Chinese economic leverage and the most geographically critical for Taiwan contingencies. If Beijing can pull Manila out of the American orbit, or even just far enough into a grey zone that base access becomes unreliable, then the credibility of American defense commitments across the Indo-Pacific comes into question, and that credibility is already under strain. The war in Ukraine demonstrated that American military aid, even when substantial, does not guarantee victory or even survival if the adversary is willing to absorb costs and sustain the fight. The Afghanistan withdrawal demonstrated that American commitments can be abandoned when domestic political costs outweigh strategic interests. Allies in Asia have watched both, and they have drawn conclusions about what American security guarantees are worth when tested. The Philippines is drawing those conclusions now, and the conclusion is not that the United States is unreliable, it is that the United States is distant, economically less important than China, and potentially unable to provide the kind of immediate, credible defense that would justify the economic retaliation that comes with hosting American bases aimed at Chinese forces. So Marcos hedges, he takes Chinese infrastructure money. He keeps American bases open. He criticizes Chinese aggression. He questions American commitment. He plays both sides because playing both sides is the rational strategy for a country caught between a regional hegemon and a distant superpower. But hedging has limits, and those limits are being tested now because China is not asking the Philippines to choose. It is making the cost of not choosing clear. Every new economic agreement is a reminder that prosperity flows from Beijing. Every delayed American aid package is a reminder that Washington's commitments come with bureaucratic delays and political complications. Every South China Sea incident where American support is rhetorical rather than operational is a reminder that when push comes to shove, the United States might not be there. And if that perception hardens into conviction, the 9 bases that anchor American power in the Pacific become negotiable. And if they become negotiable, Taiwan becomes indefensible. And if Taiwan becomes indefensible, American predominance in the Indo-Pacific ends, not because American forces were defeated in battle, but because the network of alliances and bases that American strategy depends on eroded under the weight of economic logic and political hedging. This is not a crisis that will be resolved with more military aid or stronger diplomatic rhetoric. This is a structural competition between a United States that offers security commitments and a China that offers economic integration. And in peacetime, economic integration is more valuable than security commitments. That is the reality. And unless the United States finds a way to compete economically at the scale and speed that China does, it will continue losing ground in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, and across the Indo-Pacific. The question is not whether the Philippines will close American bases tomorrow. It probably will not. The question is whether 5 years from now those bases are still operational in a way that supports American war plans, or whether they have been hedged, restricted, politically complicated, and operationally constrained to the point where they are liabilities rather than assets. And the answer to that question is being written right now. In the economic agreements Marcos signs with Beijing, in the ambiguous responses he gets from Washington about defence commitments, in the cost-benefit calculations every Philippine official makes about whether alignment with America or accommodation with China serves the national interest better. The bases are still there, but the foundation they rest on is shifting. And if it shifts far enough, 9 bases become zero capability. And zero capability in the Philippines means the loss of Taiwan. And the loss of Taiwan means the end of American predominance in the Pacific. That chain reaction starts with an economic agreement signed in Manila, and it ends with a strategic realignment that reshapes the balance of power for decades. The United States still has time to prevent it, but time is running out, and China is patient.